to share with you a few growing tips and things that can help you get started from a gardening perspective with permaculture. So I always suggest that people begin, if they're new to gardening, begin with herbs, because these are a super easy place to get started, and they're so robust. So you can start to grow herbs. I always recommend you grow herbs as close as possible. So that may be on your veranda, on your balcony, just outside your back door. Herbs like this are mostly perennials, so they're there all the time, which is a wonderful garden to have just right next to your front door. And just keep them trimmed. You're trimming them to cut them and bring them into the kitchen will help to maintain them. And you can have herbs that are culinary herbs. There's herbs, medicinal herbs. There's herbs for teas. And mixed in with that, or just beyond that, start to weave in your fresh salad garden. So your salad can be your lettuces, and you can see in and around this there's some chickweed that's growing, which is, some people consider it a weed, but it's also something that's helping to improve and cover the soil, and edible as well. Maybe some real diversity of things for salads, from other types of leafy greens and herbs and perennials and climbers like cucumbers. So there's lots of different kinds of salads to include. And so pick your favorite, start small, build up your soil first. Now, I really recommend that you grow as much as you can in the soil as opposed to in pots, if it's possible. In the soil, you start to bring the soil alive, and it's the living soil which helps to really make your plants thrive and come alive. However, if you've only got a small space, then pots is a great spot to begin. Or if you've got contaminated soil, if you're in a really highly urbanized environment, you might want to get that checked. You might want to think about having raised garden beds, which means that you can separate from that contaminated soil. So just a few things like that to keep in mind, particularly around the fresh salad greens, because you're eating so directly from the soil all the time. And I totally encourage you to think about how you can get as much leafy green diversity as possible growing. So having your herbs and your vegetables and your flowers all integrated into a mixed garden bed, where you can take a leaf off this and a leaf off that, and have as much food growing in the smallest place possible. And so in a way, this is kind of like rewilding the garden, and it's about abundance thinking. How much can you fit into the smallest space possible? And so that's thinking about design, how you can design to think, okay, so I have a plant that's sort of a taller plant. I can tuck a little one underneath that. Maybe I've got some shaded areas. I can put some shade tolerant plants beside that, and really looking at your garden with those design eyes and really planning how you can fit as much into every single space. Minimize the pathways as much as possible and create these dense, beautiful, rewilded gardens where there's always something to be eating, and always something that's there for nature too. And so it's really important to be considering what are the kind of shade tolerant plants, because particularly in urban areas you find that there are little pockets where it's hard to grow things because it might be shaded out by the neighbour's property, or it's you've got a fence and you've got lots of shade. So what are some of the plants which don't require terribly much light? Well, lettuces can grow in fairly small amount of light. Any kind of leafy green plant that's sort of a lettucey, spinachy type plant can actually do quite well with just a few hours of light. When you start getting to the more fruited type of vegetables, like I'm talking about, your tomatoes and your eggplants and anything that's a fruited type vegetable, that requires more light, more sunlight to be able to get to maturity. So stick with the leafy greens in the shaded spot, or even things like aloe vera will do quite well tucked in a nice little corner somewhere. Now, as well as the shade tolerant plants, I highly recommend that you find what are the most robust food plants that you know of in your local area, and pack your garden full of these too, and then they become the skeleton of your garden, and then you can tuck in other things in and around underneath that. So for me here in this particular environment, plants like cassava is super robust, and you can eat both the leaves and the roots as long as you cook them. Then there's plants like the Brazilian spinach, which is that crinkly one on the top right-hand corner. It is always there in the garden and is a constant source of greens. And you can see in the top corner there's a little bit of Suriname spinach. So there's lots of different edible greens. Below that is the sweet potato leaf. And so sweet potatoes and the leaves are both edible. And they're super robust. I always just leave some in the ground. It'll come back when the season's right next time. And then this unusual looking vegetable here is yacon. And yacon is just sprouting right now actually in my garden. It comes out of those crowns. Now both the crowns and the big roots are edible, also known as Peruvian ground apple. So it's a sweet root and it's crunchy, a bit like an apple. And it's super hardy, super low maintenance, no pest problems whatsoever. Kind of like these, the cassava and the Brazilian spinach too. And these plants mean that I can actually have an abundance of food for most of the growing season without really having to think about looking after it. So what are the plants in your area that are super robust ones? If you've got some ideas about the super robust plants in your environment, why not put them in the chat too? It'd be great to get a list racing down there of all the different kind of plants that you think are the easiest plants to grow, the ones that have the least pest problems, the ones that are the most drought hardy, ones that are the most resilient to all different kinds of things. So let's find out what are those resilient hardy plants. Now, as well as that, I also highly recommend that you eat more of each plant because one, it'll mean that you don't have to use as much space because you're actually utilizing so much more of each of the plants that you've got growing there. And also it means that you're getting a greater diversity of different sorts of nutrients and food sorts. So for example, right on the edge of on the left-hand side is turmeric. Now, it takes quite some time for turmeric to actually be ready in the ground. It takes about 9 months. So you plant a little piece of turmeric, stick it in the ground around about now when the season's warming up, and it won't be ready until it starts to die back when it gets wintertime. So that's about 9 months. So what in the meantime? I could be eating those young little shoots that are coming up and the leaves, and you can take bigger leaves and wrap them around fish if you're cooking. So find the ways that you can use all the different parts of the plants from the beginning. Now peas, you don't have to wait until the peas are ready. You can be eating the young shoots and the leaves and maybe some of the flowers too. And then you can eat the peas that are fresh and new, or even if you've missed some and they've gone full and dry on the vine, you can actually collect those, save some to seed, and then use the rest of those as dried peas. Then there's the pumpkin, and I talk about pumpkin all the time because I think it's such a good example of how you can eat just about every single part of this plant except for the stalk. So you can eat the leaves, you can eat the shoots, you can eat the flowers, you can eat the skin, the seeds, and of course the pumpkin flesh. So think about each and every single one of your plants that you have in your garden and what are the different parts that you can eat. It's a fantastic way to reassess and rethink and reimagine the possibilities that you have in just a small space. And of course, if you're wanting to grow pumpkins in an urban area, you're going to have to trim those runners that want to take off into other parts of your garden anyway. So why not eat some of them? You can eat the nice looking leaves and then take the rest of it and use that as biomass to put into your compost. So, either way, it's you eating it or food for the soil as a way of building up organic matter and biomass. Now, of course, in urban areas, you need to think about the vertical spaces, not just your horizontal spaces. So where is there possible that you could put a trellis, or is there a shed, or is there a wall? In what ways can you actually grow up a wall? Now, I want to just give you the heads up that often when you buy those little wall units and stick them on a hot wall, they will dry out so quickly unless you have a watering system in them. It's far better if you can to have a larger pot at the base and grow a trellis vine up it, or in the ground if possible. Now there's the benefit too, as well as being a food plant, it also helps to cool. And as our cities are getting hotter and becoming greater heat sinks, we need to think about how we can shade our walls and provide protection for the habitats in which we're living, and vertical gardens can help with that. So this is a passion fruit flower, and as well as being absolutely amazing to look at and absolutely gorgeous, it produces beautiful fruits. And even these, the flowers are edible. I made a blog post about this at one point, so you can search up their edible passion fruit flowers and see what you find. But what other plants are climbing plants? So, there's grapes and there's chocos and there's kiwi fruits. There's all sorts of things from the beans and the peas, and also things like cucumber. If you've got a really hardy wall, you might want to think about growing something like a loofah. A loofah is that plant which it's of the gourd family, and you can once it's grown, you can peel it off and use that as your bath scrub or your kitchen scrub, and then it composts. So lots of different possibilities for vertical gardens. And of course, include colour, as much colour as possible. Include all different sorts of flowers that are not just great for the beneficial insects that come into your garden. Oh, there's a little bee there too. Then think about how you can use colour to invite and attract young people out into the garden, and also just to brighten it up. A vegetable garden doesn't have to be rows of vegetables. It can be this beautiful, wild and colourful and beautiful outdoor room.